Welcome to Awesome Movie Year, the podcast where we take a look back at an awesome year for movies, which is every year. My name is Josh Bell, film critic and writer, and I am here in person with my co-host.
That's right. I'm Jason Harris, filmmaker, comedian, and Josh, I had an affair with your mother.
Man, we have just... So... Nobody yet probably has listened to our bonus episode from last season, but we're getting a lot of discussion of unfortunate things with my family members here. Jason.
It's nothing personal, Josh. For one, it's over, okay? And two...
Just let's stop. Whatever two is, I don't want to hear it.
It's just relevant to this film.
It is.
I always try to put something relevant.
No, that was
the film.
Totally responsible of you.
Yeah.
And this is... we are kicking off our 8th season.
Bang, bang, bang. Boo, 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 boo,
with those noises. And we are going the furthest back yet we've gone in film history. We are talking about the films of 1967.
The first year ever for movies.
Yes, exactly. No, I'm excited because I think, as we've gone through this show, I'm always pushing for us to look back, and we're trying to balance that with more recent stuff that maybe listeners are more familiar with and that we're more familiar with too. And it's fun to talk about.
Yeah. And what is exciting about this is obviously this is a year before all of us were born. And I really like seeing what themes reveal themselves as the year plays out. When we did 1977, which is of course also before we were born, that seemed to be, a pinnacle blockbuster year. So let's see what 1967 brings. My thinking is it's going to be a big year for the French.
That it is, and it's sort of a turning point in the development of new Hollywood. It's interesting. This is the final year that the Hays Code was enforced, although it was not very strongly enforced. But the MPAA rating system that we are all familiar with started in 1968. Ugh. So, which was better than the Hays Code, where everything just had to conform to the same standards. And at least with the rating system, there's the possibility of more adult, more explicit content with a higher rating. So
yeah, but the MPAA, get out of here, MPAA. Yeah. No one needs you anymore.
I'm just saying that, it's better than a standard in which no film can do anything that doesn't meet the overall general audience standard, which was the case for the Hays Code, and especially in the 40s and the 50s and the early 60s, and less so as we get here to the late 60s. But my point being is that it's a turning point there where all of these new artistic voices are coming in Hollywood and are influenced by those European films, as you're talking about, French films and others. And Hollywood finally sort of relents and allows that greater range of artistic expression. And boobies.
No, I know what you mean. Boobies, cursing, the use of adult material to tell your stories in a different way.
Right. Or even just themes. For years, the production code wouldn't even allow criminals to go unpunished in films.
Right.
It's insane. But if you watch movies from the 40s, that's always where they're sort of contorting the plot to make sure that they get their comeuppance.
Spoiler alert, the entire decade.
Exactly. That whole decade. So I'm just saying this is an interesting turning point year for film.
Oh, and Josh, let me be fair. Boobies and dongs.
That is...
And butts.
So fair. So, with all that in mind, as we do in every season, we're starting with the box office champion of the year, and that is The Graduate.
Yes.
Which is also amazing because imagine a movie like this being the number one movie at the box office in 2021.
Imagine a movie like this getting a theatrical release in 2021, huh?
Insane.
It is. But this was... the highest grossing. It's hard, like box office figures pre the 1980s are sort of not an exact science. So this movie was actually released in December 1967 and made most of its money later. But it did gross 104.7 million probably worldwide, which in 1967 is just an insane amount of money.
So it's like 850 million.
Yeah, it's huge. It's astounding that a movie like this made that much. On its budget of $3 million, which, again, in 1967 is a lot more, but still comparatively.
And a first-time film director.
Second time.
Oh, this was his second film?
Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf
Okay, you
is
got
his
me
first
there.
film. Yeah, but certainly an untested,
Yes.
relatively untested.
Now he's a megastar, but again, an untested star as well.
Right. I mean, this was a gamble, I think, for the producers. And Mike Nichols, who's the director here, was, I believe, signed to make this movie before he made Virginia Woolf. So he was a first-time director when he was
There you go.
signed for
That's what I
this.
meant, everybody.
Yeah. But certainly Dustin Hoffman wasn't a big star. And Jason, I know you like to talk about alternate casting. Maybe we'll get to this later, but a lot of bigger stars were considered for this and didn't end up in the movie.
In many roles. Lots
Yes.
of big stars.
Yes, but especially for that lead role that Dustin Hoffman took on. So yeah, a huge hit and an acclaimed film. It was nominated for 7 Oscars. For Best Picture, Best Director for Mike Nichols, which he won. That was the only Oscar it won. Also, Best Actor for Dustin Hoffman, Best Actress for Anne Bancroft, Best Supporting Actress for Katharine Ross, Best Adapted Screenplay, and Best Cinematography. And I think deservingly in most of those categories. And it did win Best Picture at the Golden Globes and at the BAFTAs and a bunch of other awards too. It was highly acclaimed.
Yeah, it's one of the most acclaimed films of all time.
Yes.
But will it be acclaimed here on Awesome Movie?
That is the most important thing. Will it be acclaimed here? So yes, it was. And interestingly, it's also very interesting, especially as we're looking this far back, to read the contemporary reactions to it and how it was kind of radical in some ways.
And I'm glad you mentioned the word radical, because like you just said, with the exiling of the Hays Code into this, like, this is, I'm not going to say revolutionary, but it's so different, right? Like, things that might seem like commonplace to us today. This is going to be a challenge of this season, is like contextualizing it when it came out. Like, it was probably stuff that a lot of people you couldn't or wouldn't have seen on the screen before, like you said.
Yeah, and I think it was, as these reviews, a lot of them mention, it was heavily influenced by these European films that were being kind of trickling into the US at the time, and that filmmakers were looking at, and Hollywood filmmakers were starting to look at and starting to emulate. Another cool thing about 1967, sort of a through line for us through all of our seasons, is that we always quote Roger Ebert. And 1967 was the first year that Roger Ebert was working as a film critic. So we'll hear some of his earliest youthful reactions to films.
All right, let's get to it.
Yeah. So Roger Ebert said, "The Graduate, the funniest American comedy of the year, is inspired by the free spirit which the young British directors have brought into their movies. It is funny, not because of sight gags and punchlines and other tired rubbish, but because it has a point of view. That is to say, it is against something. Comedy is naturally subversive, no matter what Doris Day thinks. Mike Nichols stays on top of his material. He never pauses to make sure we're getting the point. He never explains for the slow-witted. He never apologizes. The Graduate is a success, and Benjamin's acute honesty and embarrassment are so accurately drawn that we hardly know whether to laugh or to look inside ourselves."
You can do both.
You can, and I'm sure Ebert did.
Doris Day was one of the names who was campaigning for Mrs. Robinson at one point, if I'm not mistaken. But the nudity, I think she said, was a no-go.
Yeah, Doris Day was notoriously wholesome. I don't think she ever was even willing to swear.
Well, then this would not have been a good choice.
No, it would have been a very poor choice for her.
Yeah, so those were 2 points. British, that was the other thing I wanted to mention. An area of cinema that I really have to dig into at some point are these kind of, and we mentioned this on another episode, I don't remember which one, but these kind of British comedies of the 50s and 60s. I know so very little about them. That's a real dark spot in my film knowledge. What can you tell me about them?
Yeah, well, I think he's referencing, he actually does explicitly elsewhere in this review reference some movies of the time. And the ones I can remember were The Knack, which I'm not familiar with, and A Hard Day's Night, which I have seen. So Richard Lester, a big director of that. And I think he's less referring to, you know, sort of like Ealing comedies and that kind of stuff from the 50s British film, and more that stuff like Richard Lester, stuff that was driven by like the British invasion. And but I'm not super familiar with a ton of those films either. So well, I have seen A Hard Day's Night. And this is better than that.
Well, good for you.
Thank you. Yes. I mean, that's not really that good for me. It's an extremely well-known film starring some of the most famous musicians of all time.
The Knack.
Right, exactly.
Yes.
I wonder if The Knack is named after that movie. I don't know. So, I mean, but it's interesting to me also, like, as you're saying, how revolutionary the style is and the way that people respond to it. Ebert embraces it. This is a very positive review, and he likes that this movie is doing something different.
Yes, but Josh, I know you're going to go to the other side. Ebert does revisit this years later and kind of temper his initial review.
Yes, but not because he feels like this movie is too stylistically bold. And I think it's important to remember that Ebert was young at this time, and the sort of critical establishment was maybe less open to this boldness. So A.D. Murphy in Variety said, had the story been told in terms of straight drama, it would have been one of those boring modern Mellers, the hippie equivalent of a woman's pick, in which vacant stares are supposed to convey emotion and plot action, and jazzed up cinematics become obvious and pretentious. To be sure, Nichols, in his second feature film, has laid on with a trowel most of the current gimmicks, but thanks to a strong script, they are not noticeable for most of the film. So he's just so off base in many ways there.
Yeah, Josh, why don't you take that whole thing about the women's
Well, I think what he's trying to say, I don't know what a Meller is, a modern Meller, but I think what he's trying to say is that this could be, you know what, actually, I think what he means is melodrama. That may be like variety speak, for melodrama. Yeah. So yeah, I think what he's saying is that this could be played like a Douglas Sirk movie or something, where it's heightened emotions and melodrama, but that it is in fact done with this level of lightness and comedy, which I think is true, even though he's being very condescending in the way he says that. But the idea that the style of this movie is somehow gimmickry or that it distracts from the story, I think is completely wrong.
You're 100% right. And I think it shows just how far ahead of the time Mike Nichols was, right?
Yeah.
And I mean, like, it'd be easy to pile on this review, but I really think this guy just didn't get it, because Mike Nichols was just so, I mean, his abilities to work with actors and his ability to shoot things to maximum effect are like, he's a master, right? He's one of the major figures, and deservedly so. So I just think he was just so far ahead of where this reviewer was in cinema that it just went all over his head.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, and Variety, of course, is like the Bible of the industry, is a conservative kind of, not conservative politically, but in terms of protecting the established style or whatever. So it's not surprising that something like this comes from them at this time. But it's interesting too, a critic who's known for being a little more forward thinking, Andrew Saris in The Village Voice, was also not crazy about the style. He said, the emotional elevation of the film is due in no small measure to the extraordinarily engaging performances of Anne Bancroft as the wife, mother, mistress, Dustin Hoffman as the lumbering Lancelot, and Katharine Ross as his fair Elaine. Mike Nichols is at his best in getting new reading out of old lines and thus lightening potential heavy scenes. The director is at his worst when the eclecticism of the visual style gets out of hand. Unfortunately, the cultural climate is such that the intelligent prose cinema of Mike Nichols tries to become the intellectual poetic cinema of Michelangelo Nichols. Still, I was with The Graduate all the way because I responded fully to its romantic feelings. The Graduate is moving precisely because its hero passes from premature maturity to an innocence regained, an idealism reconfirmed. That he is so much out of his time and place makes him more of an individual and less of a type. Even the overdone caricatures that surround the three principals cannot diminish the cruel beauty of this love story. So he's really into the story and the characters, and is really quite condescending again about the style. I think he's referencing, I assume, like Michelangelo Antonioni as sort of someone Mike Nichols shouldn't emulate. But I think Nichols does a great job with it.
It's so important to everything, like some of those iconic shots, like, when Benjamin kind of realizes what's going on and we're seeing it through Mrs. Robinson's leg. Like, that shot is, how many times has that been emulated, right? The underwater stuff, which is symbolic of where Benjamin is. I mean, dude, like Nichols, I mean, and something I noticed this time, which I didn't notice the first time, was at that dinner party, or the party that they throw for Ben at the beginning, the parents, and he's just kind of swirling around the room, and you pass Mrs. Robinson on the couch, and she just looks so bored, and you don't even having never seen it and never been introduced to that character, I didn't even realize it, but so smart the way he moves the camera.
Yeah, the visual style in this movie is amazing, and the editing, especially in the montages, sort of in the middle or the first third of the movie, where we see Benjamin's ennui, and the way he cuts between him in the hotel room with Mrs. Robinson and then him at home, and it's just, I didn't write down the editor's name, and I think is it Sam Osteen is the editor, I think.
Yeah, Dave.
But the editing in this movie is amazing, and that's certainly something that's got to be influenced by like the French New Wave.
He's got that transition where Ben is putting his head down like after sex into like him putting his head down in the pool and everything, and it's incredible. Like, and dude, like the cinematography is easily one of the major strengths of this film, and that was Robert L. Surtees, who was nominated for Best cinematography. He lost to Burnett Guffey, Bonnie and Clyde. No one's going to fault him on that, right? But Surtees had this quote that I marked down, which said, it took everything I had learned over 30 years to be able to do the job. I knew that Mike Nichols was a young director who went in for a lot of camera. We did more things in this picture than I ever did in one film, which I think, none of it, use the word gimmickry. None of it's gimmicked. It's all there for a reason.
Right. And I think this is, on the face of it, not like if you just read a script or read the plot summary, you wouldn't think of this as a movie that would be visually inventive and striking in that way, because it's just about people's relationships. But the way that they approach that is a huge part of what makes this a good movie.
Yeah. So later Mike Nichols film, which I thought was close to perfect, there was one or two things that bothered me about it, was Closer, which is based on a play. And it all is just basically people talking in rooms. And I was blown away by how Nichols moved the camera in such mundane situations to keep things interested and elevating the story. So I just think he's just one of the best at doing it, right? And, when we did 77 and we talked about Woody Allen and those moving masters, you can see the influence of Mike Nichols on things like that.
Yeah, and Woody Allen, I did not write this quote down, but I saw it somewhere, and he said that Nichols was like the greatest director of comedy or something like that.
I think that's fair.
Yeah, so I'll just misquote Woody Allen there. So that's all right.
Okay.
Yeah, but you're right. I mean, it's so important the way that he uses the camera in this movie, and if it wasn't put together that way, I think it wouldn't be as good, and maybe some of the character beats and some of the comedy wouldn't come across the way that they do.
And the emotion, the awkwardness, the uncomfortability, the uncertainty, it's all there with the way he uses the camera.
Yeah, this movie is so uncomfortable. I mean, I forgot how this movie is like, at times, this movie is Curb Your Enthusiasm levels of uncomfortable, I think.
Yeah.
Which it does really, really well. Makes it hard to watch in a fascinating way. There are tons of long takes in this movie too, that he just holds the camera.
I love that stuff.
Yeah, it's really quite impressive. So, Jason, you're obviously indicating that you had seen this movie
I had
before.
seen it before. You just, it's one of those, you got to check off the box, right? Check off the list.
Yeah.
So yeah, but I had only seen it once before.
Yeah, I saw it too. And I think it was when I was in college at some point. I don't remember specifically the circumstances, but definitely just for the reasons you're saying too. This is a hugely important film, something to see. And I think we were talking about this in reference to something else, that a lot of times watching these big classic movies that have these massive reputations, I feel like it's a bit of a letdown, just because there's no way that any movie is going to be as amazing as these kinds of reputations. But then being able to come back to it another time and already having had that first experience and having had your expectations kind of punctured or whatever is almost easier to appreciate. I don't know if you find it that way at all.
I actually thought the opposite this time.
All right.
I liked it, but we can talk about that in the next segment. I liked it better the first time, and I will give you my reasons for that. But let's let Dave.
All right, Dave, did you watch this one ever before?
I'm almost certain this is one of those movies that my parents made me watch way too young.
When you were 6?
Yeah. This and,
right.
and all those Woody
And then they
Allens
introduced you to their friend.
Yes. But no, that would have been the last time, though. I haven't seen it as like an adult until just now.
Yeah.
So Dave, what did you think of the controversial camera work here.
Well, I don't know that I thought it was like that particularly show offy or anything, but I did think that the whole thing you could kind of just tell that it was something new that was going on with everything happening on screen.
It still feels new in a lot of ways, I think. It's so original the way he shoots.
Yeah, and I think a lot of, again, movies like this aren't really usually shot in that way. They're usually
Right.
shot in a lot more simple, straightforward fashion because directors are more just concerned with capturing performance and with the dialogue and the character interactions, and they'll just say, hey, let's just over the shoulder shot, reverse shot for all these scenes, which isn't not necessarily bad if you've got great characters and well-written dialogue and good actors and you're just fascinated by those interactions. But I think it does add something here.
I agree. It adds a lot.
Yeah. So anything else to add on the background here? I mean, obviously there's a ton. This is a landmark film, but anything important you want to mention?
I think we should probably mention Paul Simon here, right?
Well, right. Yes. As an essential aspect of this film.
Yeah, the
certainly.
soundtrack's a big deal. Sold millions of over 2 million copies here, and has that little song, Mrs. Robinson, that maybe you've heard once or twice.
Yeah.
And it uses Sound of Silence, Scarborough Fair. So a lot of big Simon and Garfunkel songs.
Right. And Simon and Garfunkel were initially, those songs were just placeholders as they were editing the film. And Mike Nichols was such a huge fan, he decided he wanted to use them. And they attempted to get Paul Simon to write new music for this.
He was supposed to write 3 and he wrote 1 song from what I read. And then he had this thing, it was called Mrs. Roosevelt. And he played it and he was like, no, it's called, Mike Nichols is like, it's called Mrs. Robinson and it's in the movie now.
Right.
Yeah.
And the songs that he wrote for the movie, they didn't use.
There you go.
So, but it worked out well. It's, you can't imagine this movie without those Simon and Garfunkel songs.
Very important.
Yes,
So.
Absolutely.
And also that was kind of new and revolutionary at the time too, using pop music as a soundtrack, which of course, when we get to 1984, we talked about.
We did, but this is really where that begins. And although that wasn't mentioned nearly as much as the revolutionary camera work. And in Ebert's review, actually, that was one of the things that he didn't like, but not because it was some new thing, but he didn't seem to like the songs. But other mentions were just kind of in passing. So maybe didn't seem as revolutionary at the time, but it turned out to be very influential.
You know you're influential when you have so many things that are really influential that one of the most influential things isn't even barely
right.
mentioned.
People barely even notice it. Yes. So we'll come back in a moment and talk our general thoughts on The Graduate. Welcome back to Awesome Movie Year. In this premiere of our season on the films of 1967, we are talking about the box office champion, The Graduate. And I don't know if we need to summarize the plot here. I feel like this is fairly well known.
Here, I'll do it real fast, right? Ben comes back from college, doesn't know what he's going to do with his life, has an affair with his father's partner's wife, business partner's wife, not life partner's wife.
Exactly.
Mrs. Robinson, played by the great Anne Bancroft. Then that kind of falls apart. She does not want him to ever take out her daughter, Elaine, but his parents keep kind of pushing him in that direction. And, he tries to sabotage the date, but then falls in love with her. And it kind of goes from there in the second half.
Yes, it does. And I mean, we can spoil it. One of the most iconic things about this movie is its ending.
Yeah.
I feel like people are familiar with that, even if they don't really know that much about the movie. But he ends up with Elaine in the end.
But for how long? That's that's the genius of that last shot, right?
Yeah, that is great. And one of the things also that was fascinating to me, and I feel like this was the case too, even in 1984 or 77, reading reviews of this movie, critics in the past did not care about spoiling the movie. At least 2 of the reviews that I picked up here summarize the entire plot of the movie all the way through to the end.
Well, I guess that, yes, because spoiler alert wasn't always a part of our vernacular. Right. So,
right.
I could see that as a thing.
Yeah.
But yeah. I even remember as a kid looking through newspapers and stopping reading certain reviews because they were giving too much away. Now, thankfully, they just give them away in the previews for the movie.
Yeah, but I mean, I feel like people would go nuts right now because this movie does have, it's not plot twists, but certainly unexpected developments. And I think people would go crazy these days if a review just laid it all out for a movie like this.
So, Josh, I think it's clear that you like this one more than I do. And it's a little crazy to me because I feel like I should love this movie, right?
Yeah.
And where it lost me this time I love the first 45, 50 minutes. Where it lost me is the Elaine date and everything thereafter, right? Because it went from someone making logical decisions to no one making logical decisions, and it felt untrue. And I know the script gets so much love, and Buck Henry is a very acclaimed writer and performer, and Nichols is of course a theater director, a writer, a producer, and so I just don't know how people just overlook these things, and maybe it's a thing of time and place, but there were things like even the first date that they have, right, where he goes to sabotage it and she's embarrassed. He takes her to a strip club. He's driving fast. He's ignoring her. And then she like leaves the strip club, like in a huff and like, oh, I can't believe this. And he just stops her and he kisses her. And then she's like, oh, okay. Like now that you kissed me, everything's cool. Like that would seem like she would punch him in the stomach and be like, get the F away from me at that point, That really kind of took me out of it at that point.
Yeah, I mean, I'm with you in that his relationship with Elaine requires a lot of leaps that aren't necessarily quite there. I will say that the idea that the characters are behaving illogically is maybe part of the point, and that this is a movie about a person who is in fact quite emotionally immature, as one of these reviews points out. And you're not necessarily supposed to think that Benjamin is making the best choices for himself.
No, and I'm fine with that. But I'm saying like, maybe illogical is not the right word, because you're right in your defense in that way. What I'm saying is like, I don't think some of the decisions were true to the grounded world that was set up, right? Like I believe this affair that he had, and I believe that the self-hatred involved with it, and I believe the disgust where she doesn't want him to take out Elaine, where Mrs. Robinson doesn't want to take out the daughter, and I believe that he also feels that he's probably not good enough for her. But it's just when he kisses her, I don't understand why she just goes with it, right? And then he follows her up to Berkeley, and he's like, I'm going to marry her. And he tells his parents, but don't tell the Robinsons. And it's like, at some point you would think word has to get back to the Robinsons in some way.
Well, I mean, it does, because eventually Mr. Robinson shows up in Berkeley and threatens him.
Yeah, but I mean, at that point, we've already gone to this extreme. And getting back to this Elaine character, who, I mean, if you look at it in today's standards, must have incredible self-worth issues here because of what she puts up with, right? After all of this stuff, she wants to take Ben back. And then, of course, the most uncomfortable thing is like Mrs. Robinson tells Elaine that Ben raped her. And then Ben's like, nah, I didn't rape her. We had a consensual affair. And then Elaine's like, okay, everything's cool, right? There are so many issues I have with that. Like, it's a horrible thing for her to do. And I can't see just Elaine being like, oh, well, if you say so, it's your word against my mom's, so I'll just go with your word. It would seem like there had to be a lot they'd have to work out at that point,
Yeah, I mean, to me, the biggest failing is that we just don't understand Elaine as a character, that she is barely sketched out. I mean, she doesn't show up until more than halfway through the movie. And I think, as you're saying, it does a really good job of establishing the relationship between Benjamin and Mrs. Robinson, that you believe this affair and the way that they're connected. And there's that great scene towards the middle where they're in bed and he's insisting that they talk and she doesn't want to, and the lights go on and off. And that's another one of those scenes that's shot the bulk of it in a single take. And just the way that it's constructed, where it gets dark and then it's light, and where the camera stays, and you can sometimes see there's a great shot at one point where Benjamin is kind of prodding Mrs. Robinson to reveal something about herself. And he's naive and he doesn't understand the sort of emotional journey that she's been on in her life when she's talking about having been an art major. And he's like, oh, I guess you just kind of gave that up. And Anne Bancroft has this great moment of her facial expression where you can see, even though there's no dialogue from Mrs. Robinson, all of the sort of sacrifices that she's made in her life to be this suburban housewife. And there's so much depth to that character, even without her saying a lot, that I feel like it makes the Elaine character worse, because there's no depth to that character. And things like you're saying, like, why would she believe Benjamin over her mother if he just says, oh no, she's wrong. I didn't rape her. We don't know why she would believe him or who she would believe or what she would do, because we don't know anything about her.
And even if she did believe him, right? And just for her to be like, well, you had an affair with my mom, and ruined my dad's life, but we're cool now, like, I do want to say, when you're talking about shots and their emotional impact, the reveal of when Elaine finds out from Ben with Mrs. Robinson in the background who he had the affair with, and we kind of get that over the shoulder shot with her just standing there, is like, man, that's just as good as it gets right there.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, and so much of the emotional content comes in that the shot setup, in the visual construction of the film, which is going back to why that's so important.
I just think that like it was just firing so hard until she came into the story. But I liked the conceit of it. I think there's certain things that like from a story standpoint I like, but it just all kind of became it wasn't standing on sturdy legs at that point for me.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're not wrong about any of that stuff. I think I bought into it more because I was already invested, and because I was looking at it as the perspective of Benjamin is not a good person and is not a smart person, really, and is making poor, impulsive choices here. Yeah, no one really. And his parents seem all right, I guess.
If a bit oblivious.
Yes,
right?
They're certainly oblivious. That is true. But I agree. And I think on both levels, that even though Benjamin, of course, is the most well-developed character, I mean, he is the main character, but I think in his relationship with Mrs. Robinson, you can see their connection. You can see the investment that he has in it, but you can't see it with Elaine. Not only do you not understand where Elaine is coming from, but when he says he goes from their one date to I'm going to marry her, you're like, why? Why do you want to marry Elaine? Like, what is it that you don't get it? It feels like one of those 1940s melodramas where the characters say I love you at the end of having known each other for an hour.
I agree. There are jumps and you're like, there's something missing here in a beat that I need to get from A to C. Where's point B in this kind of journey here? Right.
But at the same time, I feel like in a lot of ways the ending makes up for that, because as they're sitting on the bus at the end and he's done all of these horribly ill-advised, impulsive things, and we're like, what is wrong with you? Why are you doing these? And she has too. And you remember they're both the same age. She may be even a year or two younger because she's still in college. They're both young. They're both impulsive. And when you get that final shot, or the second to last shot of them sitting on the bus, with that iconic moment of them going from glee to what the hell have we done?
Yeah.
I think that makes up for a lot of it, because you're like, oh, they also realize that they've made illogical choices and they haven't thought this through.
The last 10 minutes are as good as any, kind of a run to the airport scene as there is, right? Where we got to have the big ending and the big reveal and the big I love you, and the energy and the electricity and the frenetic pace of it is just great. What I didn't need was like, I'm driving back to Pasadena. Now I'm driving back to Berkeley. Now I'm driving to Santa Barbara. That was a bit just mishmashy to get there,
I guess, but I think it sort of tries to emphasize the ridiculous lengths that he's going to in order to get her and to do it in time. So, I mean, I was okay with that. And that's something that's been parodied a lot.
Right. I mean, the whole film's been parodied or homaged a lot.
Yes. But especially, I don't know, especially that sequence. But yeah, I mean, I'm with you. I think maybe I'm not on the level of acclaim that this movie gets from a lot of people. Although, as you're sort of alluding to with Ebert, it has been reevaluated in some ways in a slightly more negative light. But I'm not as all in on it as some people are. I think I have maybe fewer reservations than you do, but I think all of your concerns there are completely valid.
Yeah, again, and it's difficult for us, and it's going to be the whole season, is putting it in the historical context of like what a revelation this film was at the time and just how different it was than everything that, was leading up to it.
Right. And I do think, as we're saying, you can see some of that, because some of that is, even now, again, is not the way you would approach a movie like this typically. And you can see how brilliant it is. And some of those cuts, again, especially I think that montage of the sort of listlessness of Ben as he goes between the hotel room with Mrs. Robinson to lying in the pool at his house, is still just brilliant. I mean, watching it now, I was just like, this is amazing.
Talking about things that we've seen over and over in film and, kind of referenced as an homage point, that the pool stuff is, I mean, I always think of Rushmore with Bill Murray throwing the balls in there, and Wes Anderson, clearly a Mike Nichols fan, right? Maybe more than anyone, I think you see that influence in Wes Anderson. But yeah, I agree with you, Josh, on that. And like I said, first 45, 50 minutes, I'm like, it's almost flawless, right? And then I think it lets itself down in the writing more than anything else. Which is tough for me to say.
Right. No, it does. I mean, and I think as much as Katharine Ross was nominated for an Oscar alongside Hoffman and Bancroft, and she's a good actor, but there's nothing to that character.
Right. But we can't fault her for that.
No, but does she deserve an Oscar nomination for it?
Let's see. I'll tell you who else was nominated there in 1967. I did write it down, Josh.
All right.
So 1967, supporting actress. I only wrote down that Estelle Parsons won for Bonnie and Clyde, so she was good. So
yeah, Bonnie and Clyde coming up again, and of course, deservedly winning whatever. But my point isn't that other people were more deserving, even if maybe they were. It's just that there's nothing there that makes you think that this is a great performance. It's because there's not much to the character.
Well, yeah, maybe it was just that, the one, like you said, it was the biggest box office, and two, like the kind of rapturous kind of feeling of like, bring everyone to the dance, so to speak.
Right. And that does happen with the momentum of something that's just such a sensation that everything gets swept up in it.
Yeah,
certainly.
I'm looking right now at the actor nominations, and man, Rod Steiger won for In the Heat of the Night, and the other nominees with Hoffman were Warren Beatty, Paul Newman, and Spencer Tracy. It's like, Jesus.
When do we have a list of actor nominees that are like those kinds of? I mean, I guess we don't know. We can say now that those people are such icons. Maybe we don't.
Yeah,
realize,
I mean, and the actress nominees, along with Anne Bancroft, Faye Dunaway, Audrey Hepburn, Katharine Hepburn, and Edith Evans, who I'm not as familiar with.
What movie is that Edith Evans is in?
Dave will have to look that up for us, but I don't know her as.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with her either. But
yeah, the other four in that category are just icons, right?
Right, and I think like in a weird way, a list that includes Spencer Tracy and Katharine Hepburn and Audrey Hepburn, but also Warren Beatty and Dustin Hoffman and Faye Dunaway, really shows you what a turning point this year was.
It's a bridge to that kind of new late 60s, early 70s cinema there.
It was The Whisperers, by the way.
Whisperers?
Yeah.
I'm not familiar with that movie.
Okay.
So Josh, of the other big ones, Best Picture, In the Heat of the Night one, Bonnie and Clyde, Dr. Dolittle, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner were the other ones,
Yeah.
So,
well, I don't know what Dr. Dolittle's doing in there.
yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I think this movie deserved those other nominations, and whatever one was probably deserved. But Mike Nichols winning Best Director is absolutely another
problem with that.
Deserved winning.
So, yeah.
One other thing that I find fascinating that I wanted to talk about with this movie is the ages of the actors.
Right.
So Dustin Hoffman was 30, which is not entirely surprising.
He looks very young though. Right?
He looks young, and someone who's 30 playing someone who's 21 is something that still happens quite often, right? And Katharine Ross was 27, so that's also fairly common. But Anne Bancroft was 36 in this movie. So not only is she only 6 years older than Dustin Hoffman, but I don't know how old Mrs. Robinson is supposed to be. I don't know if we're supposed to think that 36-year-olds are sort of put out to pasture, and maybe we are, but it's just fascinating to me.
Yeah, I mean, he does look at that 22-ish age, and I mean, she said she got pregnant when she was in college, right? So, and if her daughter is 20 and she's playing 40, 41, and a 41-year-old and a 22-year-old, you could see that. Maybe they aged her up a little with makeup or whatever.
I'm sure they did because she's a movie star. She's not going to look like a 40-year-old housewife anyway.
Yeah. Gina just messaged me, "Hey, I'm 37."
Right. Well, and
that's Dave's old bat wife there.
Right. Yeah. Dave, are you concerned about Gina having affairs with younger college students?
If that's what she needs.
There you go.
Right. But I just think and also, again, even if we're like, okay, maybe she's close to that age, the fact that she's only 6 years older than Dustin Hoffman, and even the other supporting characters, William Daniels, who plays Benjamin's father, was 40. He's only 10 years older than Dustin Hoffman. Murray Hamilton was 44, who plays Mr. Robinson, and Elizabeth Wilson, the oldest of the sort of adult stars who plays Benjamin's mother, was 46. But all of them not appropriately really old enough to be the parents of these characters.
Kind of interesting that
necessarily.
he made that work, and he cast based on abilities and what he thought he could get away with, and he did.
Right.
So,
And I don't think you like watching this movie. I wasn't like, this is wrong. These people don't look the right age necessarily. It was really only because I was thinking about William Daniels, who's still alive.
Boy Meets World, Girl
Right.
Meets World, Mr. Feeney,
Exactly.
Knight Rider, Kit.
And I thought, there's no way he's that much older than Dustin Hoffman and is still alive. And then I started looking all of these up.
Yeah, so Dustin Hoffman, who got paid like $17,500 for this movie and had to go on unemployment afterwards, right? The big names were, of course, Redford, Warren Beatty, Charles Grodin almost got it. And then the one I found interesting, Burt Ward from who played Robin. And the story with Redford is like, everyone's like, oh, right, you should have it. And Mike Nichols is like, no one's ever going to believe that you would have trouble getting a woman. So we didn't do that. Right. And then Mrs. Robinson, literally every big name that you can imagine.
List,
right.
Yeah.
So Sophia Loren, Lauren Bacall, Audrey Hepburn, Geraldine Page, I could go on and on, even Reese Saint, Ava Gardner, Doris Day, Lana Turner. And then Elaine, Patty Duke, Natalie Wood, Sally Field, Shirley MacLaine, Goldie Hawn. That would have been maybe interesting at that point.
Yeah,
or Sally Field. Maybe
Sally Field would have been. Yeah,
So,
I feel like Sally Field maybe could have, because I think the thing with that character is that just you need the performance to bring more than there is in the writing.
yeah, and I also think Candice Bergen, who was up for it, because she did a lot of interesting work back then.
Yeah, well, she worked with Mike Nichols soon after this in Carnal Knowledge, which she's great in.
Yeah. So, and then the Murray Hamilton character, Mr. Robinson. Gene Hackman, if you want to talk about people close in age, right?
Right.
He was originally cast, but I think he left to go do, was it Bonnie and Clyde he went and did? Or
I'm not sure.
either that or Butch and Sundance.
Yeah.
Maybe it was Butch and Sundance. I don't know. And then, Brando, George Peppard. See, this is the one that seems tough to me. I can't see Brando playing that role. I can't see Frank Sinatra playing that role. And then Walter Matthau and Jack Palance, those all seem like odd choices for that.
Yeah, and it's, again, that whole age thing. And I saw you mention Natalie Wood, that Natalie Wood was considered both for Elaine and for Mrs. Robinson.
She should have played them both.
That would have been something, yeah. Let's talk about revolutionary filmmaking techniques.
Oh, yeah.
What did you think of Mr. Robinson's confrontation scene with Ben when he finally kind of tracked him down in Berkeley? I don't know if I would have been as cool about everything. So.
Well, he's quite angry, as he should be, really. Even though, it's been made clear that, their marriage is over. And is the kind of marriage that maybe if it wasn't 1967, if it was 30 years later or whatever, they would have been divorced already because, there's no love there. They don't even sleep in the same room. And so I think in that sense, when they're first having the affair, it's easy to excuse. Like she's getting something from Ben that she's not getting at home and that her husband doesn't want to give her. But certainly the way Benjamin goes through and wrecks that whole family, like he's justifiably pissed off. And I think he's almost like a non-character. Like we don't consider him really. He's just kind of like a goofy background presence for most of the movie. And so I think it's good to have that moment where it's like, oh yeah, he would actually care about this.
Yeah. Here's a fun piece of trivia. So that, Norman Fell plays the landlord there.
Always playing landlords.
Yeah.
Norman Fell.
Three's Company, right?
Yeah.
And he's got like a bunch of like college kids, living there. And, when Elaine screams, they all go up to the room and one of them says, I'll call the cops. Who played that character?
That I do not know.
Ladies and gentlemen, it was me, Sir Richard Dreyfuss, in one of my earliest film roles.
Man, I missed that, but I'm so glad that we got the Richard Dreyfuss impression to return.
Greetings and salutations, sir.
Thank you. Thank you for that. But one other thing that I want to mention here, and Ebert says this in his review, this is a comedy. This is a funny movie, especially the first half is actually quite funny, which I forgot, I think, how funny
there's some other funny stuff in the second half where he's kind of teasing her at the zoo about who this Cal character is and everything. But yeah, and I mean, the funniest scene is probably when he takes Elaine to the Taft Hotel and they all know him as Mr. Gladstone. And
right.
And Buck Henry is very funny in his kind of doorman or mater front desk worker.
Yes, the clerk. Yeah. So yeah, all that stuff is funny. And I think that, like, more than the love story, what this movie I think does really well is capture that awkwardness of being the graduate, of having graduated from college and not knowing what to do with your life and realizing you may never know what to do with your life. And that's something I think that's super influential here too.
And is one of my favorite types of like 90s subgenres, where I think they really, that's where it hit its height, as like kind of like the indie angsty, we finished college, now what do we do with our lives type thing. There's a ton of good movies, including Kicking and Screaming by Noah Baumbach, who also obviously clearly influenced by Mike Nichols. So,
absolutely. So do we want to give this one a rating?
Sure.
Out of
3 affairs, 5 affairs with your mom? No, I'm just kidding. So, what do you want to rate it out of?
I don't know. I was gonna say like Mrs. Robinson's legs or something like that. I don't know.
Scuba diving equipment.
Oh yeah, that's another very funny scene where he's forced to show off the scuba diving equipment. Ben's parents are very into like showing him off for their friends.
Yeah. Okay. So how about we'll rate it out of the song Mrs. Robinson, because it was played multiple times.
It was.
It gets 3 Mrs. Robinsons from me, and the first half was 4, and the movie the first time was probably all 4, but it really let me down in the end of Act 2. But the last 10 minutes are again riveting and brilliant.
Yeah, I think as I was watching this, I was like, yeah, this is 4 stars for me. This is really good. But I do think I kind of lost its way a bit there in the last half or the last third. So I'm going to go with 3.5 though, because I do think it holds together a little better than you do. So 3.5 affairs or plays of the song Mrs. Robinson, whatever it is, 3.5 out of 5. Dave, what do you say?
I'm going with 3.5 as well. I agree with all the criticisms you guys are, bringing up, but there's so much to love in it, though.
There is. I mean, this is a really it is a great movie and an important movie, and if you haven't seen it, you should. And it's entertaining.
Yeah, and it's not too long.
No, that too.
But I think it seems like there are things that you guys are willing to overlook that for me were tougher to get past, I'd say.
Right, and that's totally fair. So we'll come back in a moment and talk about the legacy of The Graduate. Welcome back to Awesome Movie Year. In this premiere of our season on the films of 1967, we are talking about the box office champion, The Graduate. And I mean, we've been kind of mentioning various elements of this thus far, but this movie is insanely influential. The legacy of this movie is vast.
Yeah, and I mentioned 2 of the modern filmmakers out of the many, many that have been influenced by Mike Nichols, who is a legend, and maybe I don't want to say he's underrated, but maybe he doesn't get brought up in the same breath as guys like Scorsese or Spielberg, and he clearly should be and is by people who know filmmaking.
Yeah, and I think he's actually having a bit of a resurgence in discussion. There's a book out by Mark Harris about his career that has gotten a lot of attention lately, which I haven't read, but I know you read a lot of those kinds of books.
Yeah, I haven't gotten to it yet. I do want to watch more. I've seen a good amount of his later stuff, but I need to go back. He didn't direct a ton of movies, by the way, but I mean, he was always working, and it seemed like everything he did was winning awards, whether it was Tonys or, I mean, when Angels in America came out, back when limited series weren't like the hot thing, that won like everything, right? Every award at the Emmys, I remember. So Josh, we also got to mention this was based on a novel. We haven't mentioned that there,
right? So. And that's a weird, Charles Webb is the writer who wrote this novel soon after he graduated from college, which of course is like the time for it, and he certainly captures that. But I was looking at Charles Webb had a weird ass life.
Yeah,
he was very like anti-establishment, anti-capitalism, gave away all his earnings, and deliberately was homeless. And just a fascinatingly weird existence. That he
wrote a sequel called Homeschool, which parts were published, and they had always talked, is there going to be a sequel? Seems like a very odd plot where Elaine and Benjamin are now married, and they want to homeschool their children, but the school district won't let them. So they recruit Mrs. Robinson, and she decides she's going to like seduce the principal or superintendent. And it just seems very not maybe the best idea. So
that's insane.
And that book, it should be said, came out in 2007. So when Charles Webb was much older and, maybe had kind of lost touch with what worked and did not get very good reviews.
Yeah. And speaking of writers, I had already mentioned Buck Henry. He wrote this with Calder Willingham Jr., very, very famous screenwriter. Buck Henry, a pop cultural fixture as both a writer and SNL personality, and just kind of all over the place in the world of comedy, I'd say.
Yeah. And back to go back to Mike Nichols, I think we should mention that. I mean, he is an EGOT winner.
Yes.
Emmy, Grammy, Oscar, and Tony winner.
Amazing.
So, I mean, certainly highly acclaimed. And do you have a favorite? Well, you mentioned Closer. Is that your favorite Mike Nichols film?
There's, like I said, one or two things that bother me about Closer. I want to go back and rewatch The Birdcage, which I don't know how that would hold up now. That was a big sensation in the 90s, and I really liked it then. I like primary colors of his work in the 90s, so that's up there. His last movie was Charlie Wilson's War, which was a pretty good movie also, I thought.
Yeah, so. I think that and Primary Colors kind of go together as that political drama satire. From his earlier films, I watched Catch-22 like a year or so ago when the George Clooney miniseries came out. And it's really good. I feel like that's underrated. It was better than the Clooney miniseries as well. Yeah. With starring your friend,
Sir Richard Dreyfuss.
Indeed.
Wonderful. He also directed Gilda Live, the Gilda Radner one-woman comedy special, which is, again, hugely influential and a classic.
Right. Dustin Hoffman, of course, I mean, everyone knows Dustin Hoffman went on, despite his low pay for this film.
He did all right there.
Yeah, became a huge star. Is still a huge star. I mean, still works. He's in his 80s. He works kind of less frequently now, but still, I mean, as recently as the Meyerowitz Stories, to mention Noah Baumbach. Yeah. Won 2 Oscars for Kramer versus Kramer and Rain Man, neither of which I've seen, actually.
And I've on this show chastised you about not seeing Kramer versus Kramer before. Rain Man also worth watching, especially since you're a Las Vegas resident, Josh.
Yeah, no, I should see both of those, but I just have not gotten around to that.
Rain Man today, I don't know if it would work. We kind of mentioned that on the Geely stuff, but Hoffman's a little different as far as like he does try to inhabit something.
Yeah, I'm sure it's better than Geely, at least.
Yes, it did win Best Picture. But Josh, let's talk about Anne Bancroft, who is not an EGOT winner, but an EOT winner.
Sure.
Yeah. She won Emmys, she won Oscars, and she won Tonys and BAFTAs. She is one of the most awarded actresses of all time. Of course, sadly died in 2006 or so, married to Mel Brooks, who we have big fans of. But I mean, man, what a career she had.
She did, although at the same time, Mrs. Robinson is the first thing that you think of with Anne Bancroft.
It is. And then I think you would probably think of The Miracle Worker, which she won for before, I think. She played Mrs. Robinson. I think that came out before that, right?
Yeah, I think you're right. I haven't seen that.
But I mean, I agree with you. But also, like, I think we can't underestimate with her or Mike Nichols their work on the stage and what they brought to Broadway, how important they were.
Right. And that was sort of more of a focus for her. I will say, as far as later stuff, I like her in the underrated version of Great Expectations by Alfonso Cuarón.
It's a good movie.
She plays Miss Havisham.
I'll tell you what I love, and since we're talking about theater, is her turn on the season of Curb Your Enthusiasm, where it's all about the producers. The producers. Interesting. Maybe that'll be revisited in this season. Who knows, Josh?
Yeah, maybe. Katharine Ross, not nearly as well-known or successful as those other 2 stars, but it still works periodically. She's more of a character actress. I will say she's great in one other major starring role where she's actually the main character in The Stepford Wives, which I feel like is kind of underrated, even though it's a very familiar like pop culture thing. People don't watch the movie. And I watched that recently to write an article on it, and she's just fantastic.
Yeah, I remember the original being very good. The remake being not.
Not so much. And there were some weird sequels to the original that she's not in. But that original version of The Stepford Wives is really good.
Yeah, you had already mentioned Mr. Feeney there. He worked pretty constantly there.
William Daniels, I think, was he on the like reboot that Girl Meets World?
Yeah. And Murray Hamilton was a character actor who was in tons of stuff, movies and TV. So.
Yeah, people still know him, I think, mainly as the mayor from Jaws, who will not close the beaches.
Yeah, I mean, he's and he has a new revitalization as a meme because of everything.
That is true. So, he is quite the meme lord.
Yeah.
I mean, and this movie is sort of memed. I mean, all the icon. We mentioned the shot through Mrs. Robinson's legs, lines. Mrs. Robinson, you're trying to seduce me. The final scene in the bus. I mean, there's a million parodies and homages. I always remember Wayne's World 2, which I certainly saw far before I ever saw The Graduate, with Wayne trying to find the wedding of Cassandra, played by Tia Carrere, and he goes to the gas station. All that stuff you were talking about with the driving that you found a little annoying. There's a whole parody sequence of that in Wayne's World too.
To me, I always think of the Simpsons episodes, right? There's two of them. There's Lisa's teacher and Lady Bouvier's wedding. And Lisa's teacher was played by Dustin Hoffman. And I remember her just writing the name of the teacher in the notebook like he wrote Elaine. What about the mom, Josh? Elizabeth, what's her last name?
Wilson.
What do you have anything you want to mention?
She, was also a character actor. I think, worked, but I didn't look up anything particularly notable about her.
Yeah. So camera work, soundtrack, the way Mike Nichols works with actors, all these things just so influential. And like we said, it is probably one of the most homaged and parodied and memed things out there.
Yes. One movie that I thought of in terms of influence, and obviously there's a million, but that I just wanted to plug that I thought about when I was watching this, especially with the scenes of Benjamin lying in the pool wearing his sunglasses, was Risky Business, which is so underrated. And people think of that as a memed thing of Tom Cruise dancing in his underwear, but is so much darker and more complex than that. So I just want to use this chance to recommend
Tom
Risky
Cruise,
Business.
Co-star of Rain Man with
Indeed,
Dustin
he
Hoffman.
is. Yeah. The last thing I want to bring up is the patron saint of awesome movie year, Rob Reiner.
Yes.
Who in 2005 made a movie called Rumor Has It, which is a pseudo sequel to The Graduate that I have not seen. I was going to try and watch a bit of it before we recorded, and I just didn't have time. But starring Jennifer Aniston as the daughter of essentially Elaine and a different man who, and they're this Elaine version of the character is dead, but she learns that apparently both her mother and her grandmother slept with this same man, and she goes to find that man, aka Ben, but they all have different names. But the Ben Braddock character is played by Kevin Costner, and the Mrs. Robinson character is played by Shirley MacLaine, and it is supposed to be horrible.
That's an interesting idea for a movie, but sadly, it's no North.
Yeah, but maybe nearly as reviled as North, it sounds like.
Well, I mean, I think, like I said, Baumbach and Anderson are probably the two Mike Nichols disciples that I would probably closely align my tastes with. Do you have a filmmaker that you clearly think has been influenced by Mike Nichols, whose work? I mean, Woody Allen, we also mentioned.
Well, right. And Woody Allen was a contemporary of Mike Nichols.
But that doesn't mean you weren't influenced by Woody Allen.
Right. Well, I mean, as we've established here, I love Noah Baumbach. And so that would certainly be my choice there. I think he's fantastic and incredibly talented and more consistent than Mike Nichols. I mean, we mentioned a lot of great Mike Nichols movies, but he did also direct What Planet Are You From, starring Gary Shandling.
I mean, there's a whole big controversy to that. If you I watched that Gary Shandling documentary, and maybe Mike Nichols wasn't in the best place mentally as far as wanting to direct that or work with Gary Shandling, and that seemed doomed to fail, from the beginning. Of course, Noah Baumbach directed Mr. Jealousy.
Mr. Jealousy is pretty good. Yeah, there was a movie he made called Highball that he disowned.
That's the one. Yeah. Mr. Jealousy is all right. It's not as good as his other work.
No. And I'm not trying to say that Noah Baumbach is better than Mike Nichols, but I mean, I'm a huge fan of his. I think
me too.
Yes.
Dave, anybody that you like there, Mike Nichols?
I'm gonna get shit for this, but Garden State.
No, you're right. You're 100% right. And eventually that'll be something that we have to revisit, and I loved it when it came out, and
Definitely.
I loved it last time I watched it. Today, I don't know what'll happen.
I haven't seen it since it came out, but I do remember loving it. But, and Zach Braff was somebody at that time who was like, oh, he's going to be a big filmmaker. And that definitely did not happen.
No, not quite.
He's living a great life.
No, he's doing fine. And he has directed since then, but not anything that anybody particularly cared for, and not, on a particular, hasn't been a consistent.
He's got working. Like $200 million in royalties and Florence Pugh as a girlfriend.
I'm sure he's doing fine, yes, but he's not a major filmmaker, is my point.
I mean, I think it's a fair trade on what he's got going.
All right, fair enough. So on that note, that is The Graduate, and that is this episode of Awesome Movie Year. Check us out on social media.
Yeah, and this is going to be a fun season. We're off to a rousing start, Josh. Keep up with us on social media. I'm Jason Harris Comedy on Facebook and Instagram. Jay Harris Comedy on Twitter. GoForJason.com, built in 1967, perfect for this season.
Before you were born, amazing.
AwesomeMovieYear.com still has an About section. We're at Awesome Movie Year on Facebook and Instagram, Awesome Movie Pod on Twitter.
You can check me out at joshbellhateseverything.com, which I think maybe has some old pieces about movies from 1967 on it, maybe little bits of writing.
Keep grasping
I'm
at
trying.
straws.
I'm trying. And more recent things at Josh Bell Hates Everything on Facebook and at Signal Bleed on Twitter. And check out our producer, David Rosen's awesome podcast, Piecing It Together.
Check out Piecing It Together wherever you listen to podcasts and follow us on social media at Piecing Pod. And don't forget about our Facebook group, Popcorn and Puzzle Pieces, where we, of course, want to hear about what 1967 movies we should be covering here on the show.
Yeah, let us know. Give us some feedback. We're always happy to hear it.
I agree.
What is in our next episode?
Josh, oh boy, we continue with the legends on this one. It's our first feature. And it is a film called Who's That Knocking at My Door? And it's by a guy called Martin Scorsese.
Marty Scorsese. So tune in next time for Who's That Knocking at My Door? And thanks for listening to Awesome Movie Year.
Thank you for listening to Awesome Movie Year. Make sure to follow Awesome Movie Year on Facebook, at Awesome Movie Pod on Twitter, and at Awesome Movie Year on Instagram. And if you like the show, review us and rate us with 5 stars on Apple Podcasts.
An All Points West production, produced by David Rosen in Las Vegas.
All I can tell you is they hear the voices that you keep while you're talking in your sleep.
Isn't that somebody else?
That's the Knack, isn't it? Or
I'm
they
not
sing?
sure.
No, they sing My Sharona.
My Sharona.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I thought that was someone else.
Oh, Dave, look up who sings Talking in Your Sleep.
Let's just cut all that, though.
But I still want to know who sings it. I think it is that. So.
I know that song. I feel
The
like
Romantics?
The
Yeah,
Romantics.
there you go. That's somebody
And
else.
the Knack is My
Yeah.
Sharona. I suck.
That's fine.
You can leave that part in, Dave. I want everyone to know that I suck.